How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf 4 of Masechta Zevachim. Gewaldig. Daf Daled is great. Daf Daled is great. Why is it great? Because we do a deep dive into this requirement of Lishmah and lishem Baylim, of Shinui Kodesh and Shinui Baylim. How we know this requirement that a korban needs to be slaughtered, needs to be shchited, kabbalah sadamd, holacha sadamd, and zvika sadamd, with the correct korban in mind, that a chatas needs to be lishem chatas and an ola needs to be lishem ola. And also, the same thing also with Shinui Baylim. Right? Slaughter chatos with the intention of it being for Reuven rather than for doing Zvika Sadam for Shimon. That whole thing about Reuven and Shimon, making sure it's the right person. So we are going to learn out the chiyuvim for that today and really kind of figure that out today. Right? So these chiyuvim that we've been discussing about Shinui Kodesh and Shinui Hashem, we are going to learn the sources for them on today's daf. So that is going to be awesome. So the sections of today's daf are the requirement of Lishmah. That means that, for example, a shelamim needs to be a shelamim. So we're going to learn that in the context of a shelamim. And then the requirement of lishem Baylim, also in the context of shelamim. And then we are going to learn how the requirement of Lishmah and lishem Baylim by shelamim then is extended to all korbonis as well. So this promises to be an awesome, epic daf. So let us begin. All right, friends, we are going to begin on Daf Daled Amud Aleph all the way at the top, the very beginning of the daf. And we'll be discussing the requirement of Lishmah for a shelamim. It says the Gemara, to be in Zvicha Lishmah. Ooh, gewaldig. How do we know what we've been discussing, I'd say for the past 2 days, more or less, which is that you have to slaughter a korban to be the right korban. That if you slaughter a korban shlamim, slaughter the korban shlamim to be a shlamim, not to be an ola. We saw the other day that maybe it's better to just have no kavan at all, but let's not worry about that. So how do we know this chiyuv that when you slaughter a shlamim, you should slaughter it as a shlamim, not as some other korban? The Omerka, because the pasuk says, Vim zevach shlamim. Korban shetei zvicha lishem shlamim. The pasuk says, Vim zevach shlamim. The zvicha, the shchita, should be for a shlamim, not for anything else. Mamash geval. Again, the pasuk says, Vim zevach shlamim korban shetei zvicha lishem shlamim. V'dilma ainu shmayu. Frag the Gemara. How do you know that zevach shlamim means zvicha lishem shlamim? Maybe it's just like zevach shlam. Hey, right? For example, the Gemara doesn't say this, but I'm just saying off the top of my head, right? The pasuk says, "V'amaitem zevach pesachu." Right? It's a korban pesach. Zevach shlam korban maybe means if it's a korban shlam. That's all it means. It doesn't mean that it has to be a zvicha l'shem shlam. Right? Zevach shlam might just mean that that's just what we call it, a korban shlam be'etzim. Well, midichsiv hamakriv es dam hashlomin. Right, we have another pasuk that says hamakriv es dam hashlomin. Somebody who we'll get into what that means if that's kabbalah sadam. Let's assume it's kabbalah sadam actually. So hamakriv es dam hashlomin. It doesn't say zevach shlomin there. It says dam hashlomin. Va'azorik es dam hashlomin. Somebody does rika with the dam. It doesn't say hazorik es zevach es dam zevach hashlomin. V'loksiv zevach. We have all these other examples where it says shlamim without saying zevach shlamim. Why in this one place does it say zevach? We have hamakriv as dam shlamim, mazorik as dam shlamim, and then we have this other place that talks about zevach shlamim. Says the Gemara, I'm going to argue that zevach shlamim actually means the zvicha of the shlamim, that it's talking about slaughtering the shlamim, and that it should be l'shem shlamim. V'hochaksiv zevach shmamino shetei zvicha l'shem shlamim. What the pasuk is teaching is that the slaughtering, the zvicha, should be as a korban shlamim, not as some other korban. Okay, now that we have determined that the shchita of the shlamim needs to be with the intention of a shlamim, shar avodas minalan, how do we know that the kabbalah sadam, holacha sadam, zrika sadam, how do we know that all of those avodas also need to be lishma, also need to be lishem, shlam, v'chi tema, leilif mizvicham? And if you will suggest that, well, how about this? Just like the zvicha, just like the shchita needs to be lishem, shlamim, so I will just say that just like that's the halacha by zvicha, it's also the halacha by kabbalah sadam, holacha sadam, zrika sadam. Like, let's just say, like, they're all just the same. No, don't say it. Malazvicha shekein poselet shelo l'shem ochlin bepaisich. The thing is, shchita is more stringent than kabbalah, holacha, zrika, in the sense that there's a special halacha when it comes to korban pesach, that a korban pesach must be slaughtered for people who can eat it. So if you have a person who's offering a korban pesach, and this person is not able to eat, he may be sick, he can't eat for whatever reason, you can't slaughter the korban pesach for this individual if they can't actually eat the korban pesach. That is a halacha specific to shchita. That when it comes to korban pesach, you can't slaughter the korban pesach for somebody, right, who can't eat it. You have to slaughter it specifically for people who are capable of eating it. So, because shchita has this unique, special chumrah when it comes to korban pesach, it's in its own sort of league, and we can't learn out kabbalah, holacha, zrika from shchita. So, we're going to have to learn out Lishmah by those other avodas, because we can't simply learn it out from shchita. Ella, or mikro, hamakriv es dom hashlamim, shetehei kabbalah lishem shlam. That when the pasuk says hamakriv es dam hashlamim, so hamakriv sounds like it's referring to holacha, right? Bringing it to the mizbeach, but no. Hamakriv is actually a reference to kabbalah's hadam. What does the pasuk say? Oh, okay, fine. Okay, Givaldik. So hamakriv es dam hashlamim, shetehei kabbalah lishem shlam, that the kabbalah should be with the intention of a shlamim. That the kabbalah sadam should be as a shlamim, not as some other korban. V'lichtor v'achmane be'kabbalah v'leilev shchita mina. Frag the Gemara, okay, how about this? Why not only have the chiyuv of lishma by kabbalah sadam? And I'll say that if you need lishma by kabbalah sadam, so memele you'll need lishma by shchita, which is more stringent than kabbalah sadam. Right? V'leilev shchita mina, we'll learn out shchita from kabbalah sadam. So just write it by kabbalah sadam, and I'll learn out that memele there would have to be lishma by shchita ochit. Mishum de'ika lemifrach, well, because you can ask by kabbalah sadam, ma lekabbalah shekain psula bizar. It says v'isha, but it says you could drop v'isha. Let's drop it. Ma lekabbalah shekain psula bizar. Yeah, but the thing is, chever. Shchita is ksheira bizar. Shchita, you don't have to be a kohen to do shchita. I've been using in the examples that I've been saying Aharon has been doing the shchita, because that way it just makes things consistent, because from mikabbalah va'elach mitzvahs kehuna, from kabbalah sadam and on, you do need to have a korban. You do need to have a kohen. And therefore, so for consistency, I've just been saying that the kohen's been doing all the avodas. But anyways, as an aside. Now, so the thing is, shchita could be done by anybody. From kabbalah sadam already, you would have to be a kohen in order to do kabbalah sadam. And therefore, that makes kabbalah sadam more stringent than shchita. Shchita could be done by anybody. Whereas kabbalah sadam, you need to be a kohen. And therefore, if we would only have lishma by kabbalah sadam, I would say, oh, okay, kabbalah sadam, which is more stringent, it has to be done by a kohen, so it has to be lishma, but maybe shchita doesn't have to be lishma. Okay, so we say that shchita, so we have im zevach Shlom korbonis to teach that the zricha, the shchita has to be lishma. We also have the pasuk of hamakriv as damashtom, which teaches that the Kabbalah Sadam also has to be lishma. So Ashkechon Shchita the Kabbalah. Okay, we're on a roll. So we have determined that the Shchita needs to be lishma, that the Kabbalah needs to be lishma. Zrika Minolan. Or how do we know that Zrika Sadam also needs to be lishma? And again, when I say lishma, it means as the korban. We're talking about right now. We're not talking about Shinui Baylim over here. We're talking about Shinui Kodesh. We're talking about doing the avoda of a ola for an ola if you want, but let's say talking about shlamim, do the avoda of a shlamim for the sake of a shlamim, not the sake of a chatas or an ola or some other korban. Okay. So zrika min ola, and how do we know about zrika sadam that it needs to be lishma? If you're going to say, well, let's just say that if the shchita and the Kabbalah need to be lishma, so let's say that the zrika also needs to be lishma. Why not? Malahanishikin tunis sofin v'yeshtem b'chatos hapnimius. Okay, so when it comes to a kochim kalim, right? Kochim kalim shchitoson batzofon. Shchitoson batzofon. Did I say kochim kalim? Koche kochim. That when it comes to koche kochim, which is more stringent, koche kochim, the shchita and the Kabbalah Sadam of koche kochim must be in the north, in the tzofin, in the north of the Azar. Must be in the north of the Azar. Now that's specific to the shchita and the Kabbalah Sadam. The zrika, of course, is just simply going to be on the mizbeach. But whereas shlamim, whereas kilu a kochim kalim, the shchita and the Kabbalah could be anywhere in the Azar. By kochim, shchita and Kabbalah Sadam need to be in the north of the Azar. Additionally, by chatos anaisis bifnim, by chatos that are offered in the heichel, for example, Baylim Davar Shel Tzibur. Interestingly, in Harius, we talked all about Baylim Davar Shel Tzibur, but we didn't really talk about the actual nuts and bolts of how it's technically offered, right? That its blood is sprinkled inside of the heichel by the parochas as well as by the mizbach aktaris, I think. So, anyways, by the chatos and isim, so for example, Baylim Davar Shel Tzibur, Par Kohen Mashiach, also the Par Yom Kippurim, the Seir Yom Kippurim. So chatas whose blood is sprinkled inside of the heichel by the mizbeach hapnimi. Nonetheless, the shchita, where you will still have the shchita and the Kabbalah Sadam kind of regularly. So, for example, if you have the chatas, you right with the Par Yom Kippurim, for example, you're not going to have zrika sadam on the mizbeach hachitzon. The leftover dam, I think you'll pour on the Yesod Mizbeach. Anyways, we will get to all of these things as we learn Masechta Zevachim. But the point is, you can have a situation where holacha and zrika are not being done. For example, these chatos and isos bifnim, you're not doing zrika sadam on the Mizbeach hachitzon. You're not going to be bringing the blood over to the Mizbeach hachitzon because the blood is sprinkled inside the heichel. It's a different thing. But the shchita and the Kabbalah will still be done regularly. So therefore, I could say, so therefore don't learn out Zrikas Adam from Shchita and Kabbalah, because Shchita and Kabbalah are unique, more stringent in some ways, that they are kind of universally these are avodas that are universally done, whereas Zrika isn't universally done. For example, Chatos and Isos Bifnim, you're not doing Zrikas Adam on the Mizbeach HaChitzon, that is instead going to be handled inside the Heichel. Fine, so therefore, we can't learn out. So again, Ashkechon Shchita v'Kabbalah Zrika Minol, and how do you know Zrika Sadam has to be Lishmah v'Ketem Leilef Me'ani? And if we're going to suggest, well, let's just learn out Zrika Sadam from Shchita and Kabbalah, Malahani, but by Shchita and Kabbalah, Shekin Tunis Tzafin, they have a requirement by Koche Kochim that Shchita and Kabbalah Davka be in the north of the Azar, V'yeshnon, Bichatos apnimios, and also while Zrikas Adam would not, on the Mizbeach Chitzon, would not be by the Chatos apnimios, but Shchita and Kabbalah would be. So that kind of puts them in their own category, and we can't learn out Zrika from Shchita and Kabbalah. Elo, Omar, Kra, rather the pasuk says by Zrikas Adam, Hazorik as Dam Hashlomim, Shetei Zrika lishem Shlom, that the pasuk says Hazorik, the Zrika of the Dam Hashlomim, Shetei Zrika lishem Shlomim, that the Zrikas Adam should be for a korban Shlomim. Okay. Givaldi, Frek the Gemara, V'lichta v'rachmana b'zrika v'leilef minah. Frek the Gemara, why not only write about Lishmah by Zrika Saddam, and then Memele, Shchita and Kabbalah, which we're saying are more stringent, they're in the north, they're even by Chatos Apnimios. So just say that there's a chiyuv of Lishmah by Zrika Saddam, and Memele will extend it to Shchita, Kabbalah, Mishom Dikal Mifach, because you can ask Mat Lizrika Shekin Chayiv Olea Zar Misa, that if a non-coin does Zrika Saddam is Chayiv Misa, right? If a non-coin does the Shchita, that's fine, he's allowed to do the Shchita. If he does the Kabbalah, if he does the Halacha, he's not Chayiv Misa. But if he does Zrika, if a Zar does Zrika Saddam is Chayiv Misa. So that makes, of course, Zrika more stringent in that sense. So you wouldn't be able to learn out the other avodas from Zrika. Okay, so we need to learn out Shchita needs to be Lishmah. We need to learn out Kabbalah Saddam needs to be Lishmah. And we need to learn out Zrika Saddam needs to be Lishmah. Ashkechan Kulu, Holacha Minalin. Okay, now the only missing avoda is Holacha. How do we know that Holacha needs to be Lishmah? V'chi te'ema leilaf mikulu. And if we can say, well, we already know that Shchita, Kabbalah, and Zrika need to be Lishmah, so let's just say that Holacha also needs to be Lishmah. But no, Malakulu Shekain Avoda She'i Efshir Levatla, Tomer Balacha She'efshir Levatla. Oh, here's the thing, friends. Technically speaking, you don't actually need to do Holacha, depending on the scenario. Okay, generally, I mean, if you need to do it, you need to do it, but you don't have to do it necessarily. What does that mean? Well, say you slaughter the korban literally right next to the Mizbeach, where you can literally, you can literally just do Zrika Saddam. You don't need to you don't need to walk the blood anywhere. You're already there. So there's no chiyuv to walk in circles just to be Yitzizan. No, if you're already there, then you technically don't need to do halacha. If you're not right next to the Mizbeach, then you do have to do halacha. And that halacha would have to be the Shema. But because halacha is something that technically doesn't need to be done, I could make the argument that we should treat it more lenient. The other ones, you have a chiyuv, you have to, no way around it, you have to do it. Halacha is the only one that technically you don't have to do. So maybe it doesn't need to be Lishmah. So you can't simply just assume that halacha needs to be Lishmah, since, because Shchita, Kabbalah, and Zrika need to be Lishmah. We can't just assume that halacha also needs to be Lishmah. Elo, my crow, rather the pasuk says, the hikriv es hakol hamizbecha, ve'omer mar zo halacha sevarim. Okay, that when the pasuk says, v'hikriv es hakol hamizbecha, that you'll take all the limbs of the, what is this? Maybe it's talking about korban. Yeah, it's talking about an ola, I believe. So korban ola, you will be hikriv es hakol hamizbecha, ve'omer mar zo halacha sevarim lakevish. That hikriv es hakol hamizbecha is referring to bringing the limbs of the ola to the ramp to the mizbech. Now, so we're referring to vehikriv. Okay, so vehikriv over there means holacha. Okay, that's kind of the simple explanation of vehikriv. He brings it close, holacha. Vitanya, we learn in the brisa, vehikrivu zo kabbalah sadam. Yet at the same time, we also learn that when the pasuk says v'shachas ben abaka vehikrivu b'nei aharon ha'kehanim sadam, that's referring to kabbalah sadam. So it's interesting, right? So ve'ekrivu, which sounds like it's holacha, refers to Kabbalah Saddam. So meaning in one pasuk where it says ve'hikriv es hakol hamizbecha, hikriv means literally as it sounds like it means holacha, but at the same time in another context ve'ekrivu also means Kabbalah Saddam. What gives? Well, the apik rachmana b'lashon holacha lemimud holacha lo tapka michal Kabbalah. Basically, we use the same lashon for both Kabbalah Sadam and Halacha Sadam to teach that they also have the same halachas, i.e., they both need to be Lishmah. So we learned out that Shechita needs to be Lishmah. We learned out that Kabbalah Sadam needs to be Lishmah. Now, Kabbalah Sadam is actually referred to as Hamakriv, as what sounds like Holacha. How come? To say that Holacha also needs to be Lishmah. And we also learned that Zrikas Adam needs to be Lishmah. And just to keep in mind that this was all in the context of a korban shelamim. Right? We saw him Zebach Shlamim Korbono. We saw Makriv as Dam Shlamim. We saw Azorik as Dam Shlamim. So these were all in the context of a korban shlamim. At the end of today's daf, we are going to learn, okay, so I know that the shchita, kabbalah, holacha, and zrika of a korban shlamim need to be lishma. How do I know to apply this to olas and chatases and all of the korbonis? We will get there at the end of today's daf. Givali. So that was all with regard to Shinui Kodesh, with regard to Lishmah, with regard to making sure that a shelamim is slaughtered as a shelamim, not as an ola or some other korban. Now we are moving on to the requirement of lishem Baylim, of the halachis of Shinui Baylim when it comes to shelamim as well, to make sure that the korban, that the avodos are being done for the right person. And just to reiterate, we discussed this, we touched on this yesterday, but to reiterate that when it comes to the right person, we're going to actually get to this on Dalet Amud Beis. The pasuk says, "V'chiper olav." Right? Is that what the pasuk says? "V'nirtzelo lechaper olav." That is the requirement for the zrikas adam to be for him specifically, and that's right. The kapara, v'nirtzelo lechaper olav, the kapara of the korban, the main avodah of the korban, is Zrikas Adam, and that needs to be for the right person. So when we talk about Shinui Baylim, about for a different person, we're specifically talking about if the Zrikas Adam was done for a different person. So therefore we're talking about if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam for Shimon, or he does Kabbalah Sadam for Reuven's korban with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam for Shimon, etc. It is not that he's doing that the Aharon slaughtering Reuven's korban for Shimon. That's not what it's talking about. He's slaughtering Reuven's korban with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam for Shimon. Okay. Now, says the Gemara, Shinui Kodesh. Okay, so we learned Shinui Kodesh, right? Let's also just take a second to point out, and just in case we don't know yet, we know now that Shinui Kodesh, this is going to come up a lot, and I'm sure I'm going to be talking about Shinui Kodesh and Shinui Baylim. Shinui Kodesh is Lishmah. Shinui Kodesh is slaughtering a korban for the right korban. A shelamim needs to be, well, not necessarily slaughtering, but the avodos, right? The shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika, that the avodos, so Shinui Kodesh refers to the fact that the avodos of a shlamim need to be for a shlam. Shinui Baylim is a reference to the fact that the avodas of Ruvain need to be with the intention of Ruvain. They can't be for the intention of doing Zrikas Adam for Shimon, right? They have to be for Ruvain. They can't be for Shimon. That's Shinui Baylim. The Shinui Kodesh, which is Lishmah, and the Shinui Baylim, which is reference to Lishem Baylim. Now, says the Gemara, Shinui Kodesh. Okay, so we've just talked all about Shinui Kodesh, that we've said that the Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika all need to be Lishem Shlamim, not for any other korban. Shinui Baylim inolan. How do we know that we also have to have the right person in mind? Again, when we're talking about the right person, we're talking about Zrika Saddam for the right person, but to simplify out, if I'm talking about the right person, that's of course what we're talking about. So how do we know? Pinchas Brei de Ravami. Oh, says a Pinchas Brei de Ravami. The pasuk says, "Uvsar zevach todas shlomov." Oh, that the flesh of the zevach, the zvicha of todas shlomov, a korban toda, which is a type of shlomim, shetei zvicha lishem toda. That the slaughtering of the korban should be lishem toda, right? That the slaughtering of the korban should be with it for it to be, if you're offering a toda, then the slaughtering should be for a toda, not for any other korban. Now, if this pasuk of the zvicha needing to be for a toda, it's not talking about Shinui Kodesh, denafka lon me'asim, because we already learned about Shinui Kodesh in the first part of today's daf, the requirement of Lishmah. So, Taneu Inyan the Shinui Baylim. So, if this pasuk that says Zebach Toda Shlomov is not talking about the zvika, the zvicha being lishem lishem Kodesh, right? The Shema. So, and say it's talking about lishem Baylim. Also, wait a second. Is Zebach Toda Shlomov really coming to teach us that a korban needs to be slaughtered for the right person? Shinui Baylim. Hami Bayle. Nichdetan. 1 second. This pasuk of Zebach Toda Shlomov is required for the following price. Zebach Todas Shlomov. That, okay, we learn from this pasuk. Abachonin Omer says Abachonin Mishum Rab Eliezer. But Lamed Toda Sheshchata L'Shem Shlomim Kshera. That it says Zebach Todas Shlomov. That a Toda is a type of Shlomim. And therefore, if you slaughter a Toda L'Shem Shlomim Kshera, that's fine, because ultimately a Toda is anyways a kind of Shlomim. Shlomim Sheshchata L'Shem Toda. But if you slaughter a Shlomim as a Toda, that's already going to be a problem, because a Shlomim is not a type of Toda. A Toda is a type of Shlomim. A Shlomim is not a type of Toda. Psula. So if you slaughter a Shlomim as a Toda, that's Psula. My Hefesh Ben Zeloza, how come? How come a Toda as a Shlomim is kosher, but a Shlomim as a Toda nisht? Toda Kruya Shlomim Ben Shlomim Kruya Toda. The answer is simply because a Toda is referred to as a Shlomim. A Toda is a type of Shlomim, but a Shlomim is not a type of Toda. No. So it sounds like besides Zevach Toda Shlomim is teaching us that halacha, that you can slaughter a Toda as a Shlomim, but not vice versa. Well, onon mi Zevach kaminun kilu. That halacha is learned out from Todas Shlomim, that the Toda is a type of Shlomim, and therefore a Toda can be slaughtered as a Shlomim, but not vice versa. We're learning out from Zevach that the Zvicha needs to be Lishmah, and since we don't need to learn about Lishmah, since we already learned about Lishmah from Vim Zevach Shlomim Korbono, right at the top of the Amud, so therefore it's not talking about Lishmah, it's talking about Lishem Baylim. It's talking about Shinui Baylim. So on and mi Zevach come in, and we're learning it out specifically from the words Zevach Toda Shlomim. Fact the Gemara, Vakatami Baylim Chatas Vashum Minayin, but we still need to know about a Chatas and Oshum Minayin. What does that mean? So if you look at the pasuk, what does the pasuk say? I'm reading the pasuk. Zevach Todas Shlomov. That when it comes to Toda, biyom korbono ye'ochel le'anach mimeno ad boker. It needs to be eaten on its day. You have 1 day to eat a korban Toda. You have 1 day to eat a korban Toda, and there the Gemara right there, and there we at, and from that we ask, how do we know that Toda is not the only korban that you have 1 day to eat it, but actually a korban chatos and a korban asham also you have 1 day to eat it? Minayin, how do we know? Talmud Omer Zevach, because it says Zevach, which I guess the point is that it's kind of referring to Zvachin, to korbonis, I guess more korbonis. And therefore that, I guess the more generic word Zevach comes to include chatos and asham as well. I guess that's the point. Talmud Omer Zevach. So from Toda Shlomov, we learn that the Toda is a type of Shlomim. Shlomim is not a type of Toda. And we said, okay, fine. And from Zevach, we're learning out that the Zvicha needs to be the Shem Toda. But we say, wait, but Zevach is teaching that Chatas and Oshim also are eaten for 1 day. So Im Kain, Nichtov Kra, Uvsar Toda Shlomov Zevach. Kilu, if we were just learning out different things, that Toda Shlomov is that a Toda is a Shlomim, Shlomim is not a Toda, and we also needed to say Zevach to extend the 1 day to eat the korban to Chatas and Oshim as well. So and it could just say Uvsai, the order could be different. Uvsai Toda Shlomov Zevach, and you got kind of all the ingredients that you need. You have the Toda Shlomim thing, you have the Zevach to extend it also to Chatas and Oshim. My Zevach Toda Shlomov, why is it in that order? Why is Zevach at the beginning? Well, Shmamina Taite is to say yes, Zevach extends it to Chatas and Asham, but also Zevach to the Shlamav, that the Zvicha needs to be for a Toda. And we said if that's not needed for the Lishmah, since we already learned that out earlier on the Amud, it's talking about Shinui Baylim, that it has to be for the right person. Givaldik. So now the Gemara says, Mazel Tov. You've learned out Shinui Baylim when it comes to Zvicha, when it comes to Shchita. What about the rest of the avodas? Kabbalah Sadam, Malachas Sadam, Zrika Sadam. What about those? Ashkechan Zvicha, sure, okay, Givaldik. So you've learned Shinui Baylim by Zvicha, by Shchita. The Shar avodas Minayin. What about Kabbalah Sadam, Malachas Sadam, Zrika Sadam? And if you're going to say, well, let's just learn out from Zvicha. If there's Shinui Baylim by Zvicha, so there's Shinui Baylim by all the things. Or as we said earlier, you can't learn out the other avodas from Shchita, because Shchita, when it comes to Korban Pesach, there's a stringency that it has to be for the people who need it, etc. You can't learn out from Shchita. Nemra Zvicha b'shinui Kodesh v'nemra Zvicha b'shinui Baylim. How about this? There's Shchita, right? There's Zvicha of Zvicha by Shinui Kodesh, by Lishmah, right? As we learned at the top of the Amud, Vim Zevach Shlamim korbonis, so Zvicha, lishem shelamim. And we also have Zvicha, right? Zevach Toda Shlamim that we just learned out. So we have Zvicha by Shinui Baylim as well. Mazvicha amura b'shinui kodesh lechalakta bein zvicha l'shaya avoidis, just like by zvicha by shinui kodesh, the chiyuv of the halachos of shinui kodesh, the chiyuv of the Lishmah applies to all four of the avodas: shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika. So have zvicha amura b'shinui baylim. So also by Shinui Baylim, when we talk about Zvicha, it's not just Zvicha, it's also Kabbalah, Holacha, and Zrika. Av Zvicha Amura, B'Shinui Baylim lo techalek bein Zvicha l'shar avodas. Ikele mifrach. Gemara says, no, not going to work. Not gonna work. Sure, we learned out Shinui Kodesh by Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, and Zrika. Sure. And we know Shinui Baylim by Zvicha. You can't just now say, all right, let's say it applies. Let's say that Shinui Baylim applies to Kabbalah, Holacha, and Zrika as well. Not going to happen. For 4 reasons. Reason number 1, because mifrach we can ask, Ma l'shinui kodesh shkem psula begufa. Let's go weiter for a second. V'yeshno bar ba'avodas, v'yeshno lacher misa, v'yeshno b'tzibur kiviyachid, v'avagab de tarte lav davka tarte miyadavka. It's kind of a funny thing. I don't really know why the Gemara is doing this. It's weird. But anyways, we're going to give 4 reasons why you can't learn out Shinui Baylim from Shinui Kodesh. And then the Gemara says that then the truth is, even though we gave 4, 2 of them are actually irrelevant. But still, at least we have 2 reasons why Shinui Kodesh is more stringent than Shinui Baylim. So Shinui Kodesh is, at least for 2 reasons, more stringent than Shinui Baylim, and therefore you can't simply extend the fact that Shinui Kodesh is by all 4 avodas and extend that to Shinui Baylim, because after actually Shinui Kodesh is more stringent than Shinui Baylim. Now, to get back to what the 4 things are, the reason why I wanted to get to the end of it to show that out of the 4 things, only 2 are relevant, because the first one is already one of those that are actually not relevant. So, mat l'shinui kodesh shekain poseles begufa. That Shinui Kodesh is a psul begufa. When you slaughter a shlamim as an ola that gets to the heart of the korban, right? The korban itself is a shlamim, and you have kavana for an ola that gets to the heart of what the korban is. Okay, masha ein kain by Shinui Baylim. Okay, fine. V'yeshno be'arba avodas. Now that's an interesting one, right? This gets to the fact that I keep on mentioning that when it comes to Shinui Haguf, that when it comes to Shinui Baylim, it's specifically a reference to the Zrikas Adam, right? That Aharon is slaughtering Reuven's korban with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam for Shimon. And here we go. Here we see that in action, right? And now we're ready for it because we've prepared ourselves for it. That while Shinui Kodesh applies directly to all four Avodas Adam, right? If you slaughter the korban, right? If Aharon slaughters the korban shelamim as in Ola. If Aharon does Kabbalas Adam for the shelamim as in Ola. Halachas Adam for the shelamim as in Ola. Zukas Adam for the shelamim as in Ola. That he does any of the four avodas of a shelamim as in Ola, so that's a violation of Lishmah. But that's not the way that it works, as I pointed out. That's not the way that it works by Shinui Baylim. It's not that Aharon's slaughtering Reuven's korban for Shimon. No. It's that he's slaughtering Reuven's korban with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam for Shimon. Kabbalas Adam with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam for Shimon. Halachas Adam with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam for Shimon. That Shinui Baylim really just applies to only one of the avodas, to Zrikas Adam. So that is a additional stringency by Shinui Kodesh, by Lishmah, which is that Shinui Kodesh applies to all four avodas, which is that Shinui Baylim really only applies to Zrikas Adam. Number 3, the Yeshnu La'achar Misa, another tricky scenario that is going to be coming up in the next few days. That Yeshnu La'achar Misa, what does that mean? It means that if, it's a little bit tricky, this one, but let us say this. How about this? Let's say this. Okay, how about this? Let's say this. You have a... So what does Rashi say? Hamafish korban v'meis v'ayorish makrivo shayich bo shinui kodesh avol shinui baylim shayich meisu baylim. I think that it's a little bit of a tricky situation, right? Because you're bringing a korban for somebody who's dead, which gets a little tricky. But I think you could say this. Let's say Yaakov had said, I'm going to bring a korban. I'm going to bring a korban ola, okay? And what does Rashi say? So Rashi says actually that he had already, what does he say? Rashi says, hamafish korbano v'meis. And he had already set aside his korban. And then Yaakov dies. Okay, so he died and he left his korban to be offered. So Reuven, his son Reuven, offers the korban for him. Okay, so far it's straightforward. Okay, meaning just like if Yaakov died and he had a chiyuv to pay money to somebody, so the heirs have to, pay that money from the estate. So also when Yaakov died, he had an obligation to bring a korban, so the heirs need to bring that korban, particularly if it's already been set aside like this. Yaakov, when he was alive, he set aside this korban, and Yaakov then died. What do you do with this animal? So Reuven is going to offer it. Now, when Reuven offers it, right? So this was let's say supposed to be a shlamim, and Reuven has in mind that it's in Ola. So he kind of it's going to be a violation. It's going to be not Lishmah. The shaila is there a chayis? Is he going to have to there, right? Because we say that if it's a shlamim that's offered l'shem Ola, so we're saying it's kosher, just not Ola the Baylim l'shem chova. Sheesh. So this is where it gets tricky because the guy's dead. So what exactly does it mean in terms of what the estate? Probably also depends on was this a neder or nedava? Anyways, it's a little tricky. But Masha Einke, when it comes to Shinui Baylim, and I'm sure this I think is going to come out more in the future, it's a bit of a tricky sugya. But anyways, Masha Einke by Shinui Baylim, since Yaakov, the owner, is dead, so if the korban is offered with the intention of doing Zugas Adam for Shimon, that seems to not necessarily matter because the owner itself, which is Yaakov, is already dead. So Zrikas, so Shinui Baylim isn't actually going to matter in this case when the the owner of the korban is dead. Masha ein kain lishmah. Right? Shinui Kodesh will matter in this case when Yaakov is dead, but Shinui Baylim will not matter since the owner himself is already dead. Yeah, it's a little bit of a tricky one, but it's going to be coming up over the next few days. So, yeah, hopefully it'll get more straightforward, though I'm not sure about that. It's just like a tricky scenario. The guy who's being like, what's the obligation? When we talk about that, it's kosher, but you haven't fulfilled the obligation. Whose obligation? What exactly is the obligation? Is it on the estate? Why? I don't know. Anyways. But if the korban is offered with the wrong intention, Shinui Kodesh, that will be relevant Lachar Misa. Shinui Baylim won't be relevant Lachar Misa since the owner himself is already dead anyways. And similarly, Shinui Kodesh applies B'tzibur. If you have a korban tzibur, like a chatas at tzibur, but it's offered with the intention of it being an ola, for example, so that's relevant even for a korban tzibur. But Shinui Baylim isn't really relevant for korban tzibur. So there's an interesting Tosfos here that Kilu Be'etzem, if I understand Tosfos correctly, what he's saying is that Be'etzem, a public tzibur is technically owned by everybody, right? Meaning a korban tzibur is for the entire congregation. So every single yid is like a part owner of the korban. So like if you slaughter a korban tzibur for like a particular yid, it's not really Shinui Baylim. Technically, he's a part owner. He's part of the congregation anyways, so therefore Shinui Baylim isn't shaykh to korban tzibur. Shinui Kodesh is shaykh by korban tzibur, but Shinui Baylim is not. Okay, so we just gave 4 ways in which Shinui Kodesh is more stringent than Shinui Baylim. Number 1, Shinui Kodesh is begufay shel korban, right? What does it say? It says psula begufa. Secondly, Shinui Kodesh applies by all 4 of the avodas, whereas Shinui Baylim is only by Zrikas Adam. Shinui Kodesh is also la'achar misa. And fourthly, Shinui Kodesh is by a korban tzibur as well as by a korban. Is by a korban tzibur, whereas Shinui Baylim is only by a korban yachid. It's not by a korban tzibur. And even though 2 of these 4 stringencies are actually not really relevant, but the 2 that are relevant, and therefore, at least in 2 ways, Shinui Kodesh is more stringent than Shinui Baylim, and we can't automatically say that Shinui Baylim applies to all 4 avodas, since it applies to all 4 avodas by Shinui Kodesh, since Shinui Kodesh is more stringent than Shinui Baylim. Ma'ishna Shinui Baylim dilave psula begufo. Right, the first, right, we said that 2 of the 4 stringencies that we just mentioned are actually irrelevant. The first one that's irrelevant is dilave psula begufo, that we said that Shinui Baylim is not psula begufo. The psul is not in the heart of the korban. Machshava ba'alma. Because after all, Shinui Baylim is only a thought. Aharon slaughtered Ruvain's korban with the thought that he's going to do Zrikas Adam for Shimon. But Shinui Kodesh nami machshava ba'alma. But one second, by Shinui Kodesh, by Lishmah, it's also just a thought. Aharon slaughters Ruvain's shelamim with the thought that it's an olah. So Ella came in the achshava pasla, achinami came in the achshava pasla, and therefore, when it comes to Shinui Kodesh, it's simply a machshava that is making it possible. The thinking that the shelamim is an olah. So you're also thinking that the Ruvain's korban is for Zrikas Adam for Shimon is also simply a machshava, and therefore, in that sense, you can argue that Shinui Kodesh isn't necessarily more stringent than Shinui Baylim when it comes to the concept of psulo begufo, because they're both just machshavas. And then secondly, the la'achar misa one, Pinchas breder Rab. So here it says Mari, but it's breder Rab. In all the other places, it's breder Rab Ami. The Amar Yesh Shinui Baylim la'achar misa. The Pinchas breder Rab Ami says that there is Shinui Baylim la'achar misa. Right. So we had said, we had said that one of the stringencies of Shinui Kodesh over Shinui Baylim is that Shinui Kodesh applies la'achar misa, but Shinui Baylim doesn't. But according to Reb Pinchas breder Rab Ami, Shinui Baylim also applies la'achar misa. So if that's the case, then that isn't a stringency by Shinui Kodesh, because it also applies to Shinui Baylim, but tarte mia ika limifrach. But even so, there are still two stringencies when it comes to Shinui Kodesh. So back to our question. How do we know that Shinui Baylim applies to Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, and Zrika? We wanted to say, well, let's just say since it applies to Shinui Kodesh, and Shinui Kodesh is by all four, so let's just say that Shinui Baylim is also by all four, but we say not necessarily, because Shinui Kodesh is more stringent than Shinui Baylim in at least two ways, and therefore we're going to have to find more specific ways as to why Shinui Baylim would apply to all four avodas. Ela Amar Ravashi, rather says Ravashi, Amar Kol, the pasuk says, "V'nir tzelo l'chaper all love." That, what's this pasuk by? Where's this pasuk? V'samach yoda rosha ola, v'nir tzelo l'chaper all love. That the chaper alav is referring to the zrikas adam, and it has to specifically be a love for him. V'lo al chavero, not for his friend. So kilu the zrikas adam. So the zrikas adam needs to be for Ruvain, not for Shimon. Baylim, you would also 1 second, but is V'nir tzelo l'chaper olav teaching us Shinui Baylim by zrikas adam? Haimi Bayle, what that pasuk is needed is l'chadatani, like we learned in the Brayso. V'nir tzelo l'chaper olav, Reb Shimon Omer says of Shimon, es she'olav chai b'achrayuso. V'she'eno olav eino chai b'achrayuso. V'amar v'yitzchak bar avdimi my time kim the Omer olai k'mandatona kisvei dami. This is the distinction between a neder and a nidava. I think that we mentioned it on Daf Beis already. It's going to come up again later. That the difference between a neder and a nidava is that a neder is when a person says, I am going to bring a korban. And until he successfully brings a korban, he kosherly brings a korban, he still has this obligation to bring one. And if he sets aside an animal and that animal drops dead, well, then he's got to set aside another animal. Until he successfully brings a korban, he has an obligation to bring one. Now, a nidava is when he says, I'm going to bring this animal as a korban. Well, then his chiyuv, his obligation is restricted to that particular animal. If this animal drops dead, well, okay, well, the obligation was to bring this animal. This animal's dead. He's obviously not going to offer it. So, okay, done. He doesn't have an obligation anymore. So now, when the pasuk says, V'nir tzelo l'chaper alav, so we're saying that, that this korban will now successfully fulfill the obligation that was alav, that was upon him, that he had this obligation to bring a korban, and until he's v'nir tzelo, and until he successfully brings a korban, then it's still going to be alav, and once he's v'nir tzelo, once he successfully brings a korban, it will be l'chaper alav, he will successfully be fulfilling his obligation. So again, like the following price, that when it's a neder, when it's alav, when he says hare alai korban, he says I'm going to bring a korban. So then chai b'achrayuso, he's going to be chayiv to bring this korban until he successfully brings one, even if he had made several attempts prior, and each time the animal died or got a mum or whatever it might be. He's going to have to keep trying until he successfully brings a korban. Until he brings a korban, he's going to have the chiyuv. V'she'eno alav, but if it's not alav, if it says, right, if he doesn't say, I'm going to bring a korban, but that this animal is going to be a korban, well then, enu chai b'achrayuso. So if anything happens to the animal, well then, he is not responsible to make a replacement because he only committed to offering this animal. If this animal dies, well, it's dead. He says, my time outcome came into Omer, a lie. When a person says, upon me, it's like the obligation is upon his shoulders to bring it, and it's all there. It's continually on his shoulders until he unloads it from his shoulders by bringing a korban successfully. So therefore, v'nir tzelo, the chaper alav, that v'nir tzelo, that only once the korban is brought successfully, it will sort of appease his obligation that is alav, that is upon him. Now, so if Ashi wants to learn out the chiyu, wants to learn out Shinui, Baylim in the context of Zrikas Adam, from the pasuk of V'nirtza lo lechaper alav kapara, the most important part of the korban, being the Zrikas Adam, which is where the kapara lies, and that has to be alav, it has to be for Reuven, not for Shimon. However, V'nirtza lo lechaper alav comes to teach us that when you have a neder, you will be obligated to offer a korban until you successfully offer one. And until you successfully offer a korban, it's still going to be alav upon him. So Rav Ashimi v'nirtza lo lechaper ka'amar. Yeah, the thing is, what we were talking about just now, about you have the obligation until you successfully bring a korban, that's from alav. That's from, it's upon him, and it will continue to be upon him until he successfully brings a korban. What Rav Ashi is learning out is from v'nirtza lo lechaper. That right, v'nirtza lo lechaper. Interesting. Is he learning out from what is that? Oh, I'm sorry. So alav is going to be right for the neder, but Rav Ashi is learning out from v'nirtza lo lechaper. Same concept, but he's learning it out. I was saying from alav. I made a mistake. It's from v'nirtza lo. But the point is that both halachas are being learned out from different parts of the pasuk. Right, the halacha of the neder and having the obligation to bring a korban, and you have this chiyuv to bring a korban until you successfully bring one. That's being learned from alav when he says, right? What does he say? Es she'alav chay b'achrayuso. That halacha is learning out from alav, and Rav Ashi is learning out from v'nirtze lo lechaper, that the kapara, the zrikas adam, has to be low for him, for Reuven, not for Shimon. So now it says the Gemara, Mazel Tov. So we've learned out by Shinui, Baylim, Shchita needs to be the Lishmah, right? We learned that out from Zevach Todas Shlomo, that the Shchita needs to be the lishem Baylim. We also now just learned out from V'nirtza lo lechaper that the kapara, the Zrikas Adam, needs to be the lishem Baylim. What about the Kabbalah Adam? What about the Holachas Adam? So that's what we need to figure out. Ashkan, Zvicha, Vizrika. So we learned out that Zvicha and Zrika need to, right, Shinui. Baylim is relevant to Shchita and Zrika, that they have to be for the right person. Where am I? Ashkan, Zvika, Vizrika, Kabbalah Minon. What about Kabbalas Adam? How do we know that Shinui Baylim is shaykh to Kabbalas Adam? And if you're going to say, well, how about this? Just like Shinui Baylim is shaykh to Zvicha and Zrika, let's say that it's also shaykh to Kabbalas Adam. Mal Zvicha v'Zrika shekain avoda shechayoven olea b'chutz. Of course, there's the concept of shchutei chutz. You're not allowed to offer korbonis outside of the base Hamikdash, and that applies, or the Mishkan, and that applies. So if one, the Shchita or Zrika bachutz, so then there is I think it's a chiyuv kares, but that wouldn't be by Kabbalah Saddam. So therefore, Shchita and Zrika are more stringent in that they have this concept of a chiyuv, I believe, kares bachutz, outside of the Beis Hamikdash or the Mishkan, which is not the case by Kabbalas Hadam. Rav Ashi, this is Rav Ashi, also mi'el nazir. Okay. Says Rav Ashi, we're learning it out from the el nazir. Who can tell me what a nazir is? A nazir, of course, is a person, we learned the Sechta Nazir a long time ago. So a Nazir, of course, is a person, whatever, he takes a neder Nazirus, and for 30 days he's a Nazir, without getting into the details, goes out of Nazir, doesn't drink wine, anyways, and other things. At the end of his Nazirus, when he's done, when he's completed his Nazirus, he brings 3 korbanos, a chatos, an ola, and a shlamim. We're talking about the shlamim. So we're learning that from the El Nazir, from the korban shlamim of a Nazir. That this ram of the Nazir, Yaisa, he will make Zevach Shlomim, will make it into a Shlomim Shetei Asiyaso, Yaisa, Shetei Asiyaso, all of its doings, it's Shchitaing, it's Kabbalah ing, it's holacha ing, it's zrika ing, all of its ings, lishem, shelamim, need to be for a shelamim. There ya go. That when it comes to the korban shelamim of a nazir, all of the asiyas, all of the stuff needs to be the shame shelamim. V'meinu inyan l'shinui Kodesh denafkale me'asim. And of course, if it's not learned out for lishem shelamim, for Shinui Kodesh, for Lishmah, because we already know that from the very beginning of today's Daf, we already learned out Shinui Kodesh, that's behind us, that's already been solved. So Taneu Inyan the Shinui Baylim. So there you go. Let's learn it out all in one fell swoop. That, how do we know that Shinui Baylim for Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika? From the fact that it says by the El Nazir, it says Yaise Zevach Shlamim Shtei Asiyaso L'Shem Shlamim. All of its doings, it's shchita, it's Kabbalah, it's holacha, it's zrika, all of it needs to be the shem shlamim. And if it's not talking about Shinui Kodesh, because we already know Shinui Kodesh, memela it's talking about Shinui Baylim, so there. Omelei Rav Acha bar Abba leRave, says Rav Acha bar Abba to Rave. Now he comes Rav Acha bar Rave to ruin our quick fix. And he says, wait, Ema, I will say that Yaise, what was it? Yaise Zevach Shlamim. I'm going to argue that Yaise Zevach Shlamim is a klal and a prat. Yaise Zevach. Let's read it inside. Ema Yaise klal. I'll say that when the pasuk says by the El Nazir Yaise, that's a klal. He will do it. It's a reference to all of the avodas. The shchita, the Kabbalah, the holacha, the zrika. But then it says, Yaise, Zevach. It says Zevach. Zevach is a prat. Not all four of the avodas, just the zvicha. Klal ufrat, ein bechlal elamash befrat. As we know from the past 5.5 years, when you have a klal followed by a prat, not a klal ufrat uklal, but right, let's just do a quick review. When you have a klal, a general rule, followed by a prat, a specific rule, ein bechlal ela mashi befrat. It's limited to the prat and nothing else. So in this case, you have yaise, which is a reference to shchita, Kabbalah, holacha, and zrika. But then it says yaise zevach, only the zvicha, nothing else. So sorry to poop the party, but I'll argue that this is a klal ufrat, and actually, but when we say yaise zevach shlamim, we're only talking about the zvicha. Maximum we can learn is that the zvicha with that Shinui Baylim Mishayach the zrika, and that is all. Right? Klal ufrat uchlal, however, would be, and this is going to be relevant in a minute. So, also a little spoiler alert, but klal ufrat uchlal ein bechlal ela ke'ein haprat. Right? Is that klal ufrat uchlal? You have to done ela ke'ein haprat, right? What happens there is actually the second klal now actually expands it more, right? Klal ufrat ein bechlal ela mash befrat. Klal ufrat is limited to the prat. But when you have klal ufrat uchlal, the second klal actually expands the prat to things that are similar to it. So now, back in the Gemara, let's read that again. So I'm Rav Acha bar Abba l'Rave. Ema, I'll suggest yaise klal zevach prat. That yaise is a klal, zevach is a prat. Klal ufrat, when you have a klal followed by prat, ebechlal ela masha befrat. The general, the klal, which is yaise, which is a reference to shchita, Kabbalah, holacha, zrika, is limited to the prat, zvicha in, midach lo. Sorry to poop the party, but yaise zevach shlamim is actually only going to be limited to the zvicha alone. But now, says the Gemara, iksiv yaise shlamim zevach kidika omar. So the Gemara says, one second. If it says yaise shlomim zevach, wait, what does it say? It says yaise zevach shlomim. But if it says yaise shlomim zevach, then beseder. Kilu yaise shlomim, you'll do all of the doings of the shlomim, right? All of the doings need to be for a shlomim, which we say is going to be Shinui Baylim, and all of the doings of the shlomim is shchita, Kabbalah, holacha, zrika, and those all need to be for a shlomim, which essentially we'll learn out Shinui Baylim. And then it says Zevach, limiting it to Zvicha. But it doesn't say Yaise Shlomim zevach. It says yaise zevach shlamim. It's breaking up the klal. The klal would be yaise shlamim, but slipped in between yaise and shlamim is zevach, breaking up those two words, i.e., breaking up the klal. You have a broken klal. You can't learn out anything from a broken klal. Right? So again, iksiv yaise shlamim zevach. If it said yaise shlamim, which is referring to all of the avodas of a shlamim, shchita, kabbalah, olacha, zrika, and then it says zevach, we'll say, okay, fine, it's only limited to zevach, but it doesn't say that. Come right, all fine and good. It would be like you suggested, klal ufrat. But hashli l'chsiv yaise zevach shlamim, that yaise and shlamim is split in half by the word zevach, will have a klal she'eno mali. It's an incomplete klal. It's a klal that's broken. V'chol klal she'eno mali ain't done in oso b'chlal ufrat. And when you have a broken klal, you can't apply klal ufrat when you're talking about a broken klal. So there goes that. Nice try, Rav Acha bar Abba. Okay. So again, so we wanted to say that yaisa zevach shlamim, we want to say that all of the asiyos have to be lishmah, shchita, kabbalah, halacha, zrika, all of them have to be lishmah. And if we don't need to be talking about Shinui Kodesh, because we already know that, let's say it's talking about Shinui Baylim, that applies to all of the avodas. We tried to say that maybe it's limited to zvicha, but that would be through klal ufrat, but we said that that's broken. Ravina Amar says, Ravina, la'olam danin. Says Ravina, actually, you know what? You can learn it out. No problem. Yaisa zevach shlamim, you can learn out klal ufrat, no problem. But the thing is, v'la'Hashem chazer v'cholol. But the thing is, it says, Yaisa zevach shlamim la'Hashem. La'Hashem is a klal. And therefore it's klal ufrat uklal. Let's go a little bit weiter. But it says Rav Achim midifti l'Ravino, v'holo dami klal l'kam l'klal l'basu. But says Rav Achim midifti to Ravina, but the first klal of Yaise, which is reference to shchita, kabbalah, holacha, and zrika, is unlike the second klal, which is la'Hashem. La'Hashem is all of the things that are la'Hashem, not just shchita, kabbalah, holacha, and zrika, but also, for example, right, the shiari adam, pouring that on the Yisod HaMizbeach, right? Klal l'kama marbe asiyos. Let's read inside that the first klal of Yaise shlamim, betzim, so that is the asiyos, marbe asiyos, v'sulo, and nothing more. So shchita, kabbalah, halacha, and zrika. Klal basra, but the second klal of la'Hashem, kol la'Hashem, anything that's for Hashem, not just shchita, kabbalah, halacha, and zrika, but vafilu shpichas shirayim, right? Even the leftover blood after the zrikas adam would be poured al Yisod HaMizbeach, will be poured on the Yisod of the Mizbeach. I don't have a diagram of the Mizbeach here, nor do I think that we need to look at a diagram of the Mizbeach at this moment. I'm sure that we're going to be looking at diagrams of Mizbeachs, sometime, I imagine, relatively soon. But whatever, basically at the bottom of the Mizbeach, there was this thing called the Yisod, let's just say, and the leftover blood was poured on the Yisod, the foundation of the Mizbeach. So, Shvichas Shiraim, Vaktoras Emurin, and the burning of the Emurin, of the parts that are burnt on the Mizbeach. So Yaise is just talking about the Asiyas, Shvicha, the Avodas Adam, Shvicha, Kabbalah, Halacha, and Zrika, whereas la'Hashem includes other things like Shvicha Shirayim and Vaktoras Emurin. So Atana Dever Bishmal, Bechlali Ufrate, again, Atana Dever Bishmal, Bechlali Ufrate, Darish Ki Agavna, Klal Ufrat Uchlali Tadan Ela Kena Prat. But actually, the Tana Dever Bishmal doesn't have a problem with this. Tana Dever Bishmal says you can do it, no problem. So when you have, therefore, friends, by the El Nazir, we have Yaisa Zevach Shlamim L'Hashem, and we want to say all good, even though we have a million reservations. We push through the reservations and we say, no problem. Yaisa Zevach Shlamim Lashem is a klal ufrat uchlal. The klal being Yaisa Shlamim, the prat being Zevach, and the Lashem being the second klal, right? Yaisa Shlamim is klal, Zevach is prat, Lashem is another klal ufrat uchlal. And according to Tana the Bishmal, they have no problem recognizing this as a klal ufrat uchlal. So now, friends, here we go. Klal ufrat uchlal iatadon elekena prat. So, of course, the halacha is when you have a klal ufrat uchlal. So the halacha is that we are going to be learning out things that are similar to the prat. What's the prat? Zvicha. So ma prat meforish avoda uvainon lishman. So just like the prat, zvicha is one of the avoda sadam, and it needs to be lishma. Avkol avoda uvainon lishman. So therefore, all of the avodas, all of the avoda sadam, not just zvicha, but kabbalah, holacha, zrika, all of them are avodas, and all of them would need to be lishman. Now, of course, when we say lishman over here, it's not talking about Shinui Kodesh, because we already know all of the avodas by Shinui Kodesh, so it's going to be talking about Shinui Baylim. Okay, so we want to say that from klal, ufrat, uchlal, we're coming to include all of the avodas, shchita, kabbalah, olacha, and zrika, that Shinui Baylim would be relevant to them. Perfect, Gemara. Imah prat meforish, that zvicha is something, avoda v'chayvin aleh b'chutz, that zvicha, zevach, zvicha, shchita, is something that you would be chayiv kares for shchutei chutz, if you do it outside of the Beis Hamikdash or Mishkan. I've called avoda v'chayvin aleh b'chutz, so I'll say that actually what we're coming to include is only avodas similar to zvicha, in that you'd be chayiv b'chutz, i.e. shchita v'zrika in, that would actually only be including shchita and zrika. Those are two avodas that you'd be chayiv for bachutz. In kabbalah v'olacha, lo, but not kabbalah and holacha, where you would not be chayiv bachutz. Inami, alternatively, I could make the argument, ma prat meforish davraton sofon v'yeshnu b'chatos apnimios. Shchita is something that by kodesh kodshim needs to be done in the north of the Azara, and you would do it also even by chatos pnimios. Afkolaton safun v'yeshnu b'chatos pnimios shchita v'kabbalah in zrika v'olacha lo. Well, if that's the case, maybe I'll only include things similar to zvicha, in that they would be done by kodesh kodshim in the north of the Azara, and they would be shaykh to avodos anasos, chatos anasos bifnim. So no. So what would fill that bill? Shchita and kabbalah. No. So we can say that klal ufrat uchlal is actually only coming to refer to zrika and to shchita and zrika. Alternatively, we could say it's only, right? I mean, if we say that it's things that are shaykh to avodas, right, chayiv bachutz, so then that's shchita. Well, it's shchita, and it's only coming to include additionally zrika. If we say that what's unique about shchita is that it's something that has to be done in the north, and also it's shaykh to chatos and asib b'fnim, well, then that would be shchita and kabbalah. So we can basically, one way, okay, so obviously we know that that shchita is shaykh to Shinui Baylim. The question is, what else can we pull in? We wanted to say, well, let's klal ufrat uchlal. Let's say that all the four avodas are similar to shchita, and therefore let's include shchita, kabbalah, olacha, zrika. To which we say, well, maybe what it means, maybe it's similar in that you're chayiv bachutz, in which case it's only pulling in the zrika, or maybe it's talking about it's similar in that it would have to be done in the north of the mizbeach and chatos apnimis, in which case it's only including kabbalah. So what do we do? So we could say either one. We could say that it's coming to include shchita, it's coming to include zrika, or it's coming to include kabbalah. How about this? Let's say both. Shkulinin, v'avoshnin. All right, let's bring them both in. After all, it's a klal ufrat uchlal. It's coming to include ke'eina prat. If they're both similar to zvicha, let's bring them both in. Okay, so we've learned out zvicha needs to be right. That Shinui Baylim is shaykh to zvicha, as well as Zrika, as well as Kabbalah. Now, we learned earlier on the daf that Kabbalah Sadam is referred to as the krivu, right? Holacha Sadam, to say that holacha is then also goes hand in hand with Kabbalah Sadam. So basically, we have Shchita is shaykh to Shinui Baylim, so is Zrika, so is Kabbalah Sadam, and Memelev Kabbalah Sadam is shaykh, then so is holacha Sadam. Givaldig. Lishnachrina v'chada teku b'milsa. Okay, it's basically saying the same thing in different words, that you could bring in both Zrika and Kabbalah / holacha. Givaldig. Ibai same. Alternatively, Zrika midavashi nafka. Alternatively, we don't need to learn out Zrika from Klal Ufrat Uchlal, because we already know Zrika from Rav Ashi earlier, which was Vinirtza lo lechaper. The kapara is Zrika Sadam. It has to be lo, it has to be him, not for somebody else. So from there, we know Shinui Baylim already by Zrika, and therefore we could say Klal Ufrat Uchlal is coming to include Kabbalah / holacha. Okay, amazing. Friends, that got super technical at the end there. But if you haven't realized, we're in a really good place. Why are we in a really good place? Because we have just learned from what was it? Ve'asisa zevach shlamim. What was it? What did the pasuk say? Oh, vavoy. Yaisa zevach shlamim l'Hashem. From that, by the El Nazir, it says, Yaisa Zevach Shalom L'Hashem. We had this whole Klal Ufrat thing, and basically where we are right now is that at least by an El Nazir, we learn now that the Shchita, the Zrika, the Kabbalah, the Holacha are all Shayach to Shinui Baylim. So we're in a really good place, at least vis-a-vis the El Nazir. So now we have to start expanding things. So El Nazir, where am I? Okay, so we found that at least by the El Nazir, Shinui Baylim applies to all of the steps, all of the avodas. Shar shlamim minolan. How do we know that by other korban shlamims we would have this same principle, that Shinui Baylim would be shaykh to all of the avodas by other shlamims as well? If we can say neilef mi El Nazir, well, let's just say, well, if that's the case by El Nazir, let's just apply it to all shlamims. Well, male El Nazir shekain yesh imo dab machir. Well, El Nazir doesn't come in a vacuum. The El Nazir is just one of 3 korbonos. It's a shlamim that comes together with a chatas and an ola. So we can't apply it necessarily to just regular old shlamim. Well, im kain nichtov shlamov, my shlamim. The rabbis call shlamim. When it comes by El Nazir, it says shlamim l'Hashem. If it was only to be limited to the El Nazir, it would say shlamav. But it says shlamim to include all shlamims. Now, friends. Another check-in over here. Another check-in. Cheva. It's been a long daf, really technical, but we're in a really good place. Why are we in a really good place? Because what have we accomplished through all of our hard work on Daf Dalet of Masechtas Zevachim? Well, so far we have learned that by Shinui Kodesh, right, Lishmah, in the context of a shlamim, right, as we learned at the very beginning of the Daf, Zevach shlamim ya korbanu, right, and all of those. So we learned about Shinui Kodesh by the Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika, by a korban shlamim. We also just finished learning out Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika, by Shinui Baylim, also by a korban shlamim. The only thing left for us to do, right? Basically, we've learned out Shinui Kodesh and Shinui Baylim in its entirety. When it comes to a korban shlamim, all we need to do right now is just expand it to all of the other korbonis. Here we go. We're really close. Ashkechan shlamim. So we find Shinui Kodesh and Shinui Baylim by Shlamim, Shar Kol Kachim Minolan. How do we know now to extend this to all the other korbanos? If you're going to say Neilaf Mishlamim, well, let's just say, well, if it's the halacha by Shlamim, it's the halacha by all the korbanos. No. The Shlamim shekin tun in smicha, vinisachim, vitrufas chazav v'shok. Shlamim has some unique halachas. Shlamim, you have to do smicha, which is putting all your weight on the head of the animal before slaughtering it. Additionally, by Shlom, there's Nisachim, Minchas Nisachim, a special flour offering that is brought with the Shlomim, as well as Nisuch right? That minchas nesachim as well as nisuch hayayin, wine libations, and additionally by korban shlamim, right? Of shlamim, of course, everybody gets a part of it. The emurim, the some parts are burnt on the mizbeach, other parts are right. The chazav ashok, the breast and the back right thigh go to the kohen. The rest of the meat goes to the owner of the animal, and before the owner of the animal gets all of his meat, the kohen takes the breast and the back thigh that he gets, that the kohen gets, and the owner and the kohen together wave it in all sorts of directions. That's tnufa. So shlamim has all of these requirements, which isn't by all of the korbonis, and therefore, how do we know to extend Shinui Kodesh and Shinui Baylim to all of the korbonis? Hello, my kra. Well, because we have a pasuk that says, where is this pasuk? Okay, we have a pasuk that says, "Zo satora laola, la mincha, v'la chatos, v'la osham, v'la minluim, u'lezevach shlamim." Hekeshin hakos of the shlamim. The Torah, the pasuk, compares all of the different korbanis to a shlamim. Shlamim ben Shinui Kodesh, ben Shinui Baylim, ba'inon Lishmah. Just like by shlamim, we require Lishmah by Shinui Baylim as well as by Shinui Kodesh. Afkol ben Shinui Kodesh, ben Shinui Baylim, ba'inon Lishmah. So by all of the korbanos, we require Lishmah by Shinui Baylim and by Shinui Kodesh. Chevre, we're not done with the daf yet. There's a few more minutes to the daf, but friends, we've arrived. We've just worked really hard, but we've gotten to a clear goal, mission accomplished, which is that we have learned out what we set to learn out, which is Shinui Kodesh and Shinui Baylim must be Lishmah by Shchita, Kabbalah, Zrika, and Holacha by all korbanis. Great work, friends. And now to wrap up the daf, Ema Eicha Deshachit Lehu Shelo Lishma Lifsilu. Maybe if the korban was slaughtered not Lishma, maybe why are we saying that it's kosher Elishlo Ailu the Baylim Lishem Chova? Maybe it should be completely puzzle. On Makra, the pasuk says, Motza, as we learned already on Daf Beis, Motza, I believe it was Daf Beis, Motza Sfosecha Tishmor Ve'asisa Kashena Darta Ve'gomer Hai Nidava Nederu, right? It says in the pasuk, Neder, and it also says Nidava. Why does it say Nidava? It should say Neder, or it says Kashena Darta L'Shem L'Kecha Nidava. What do you mean? You make a Neder as a Nidava? Either should be kasher nadarta shem kecha neder or nadavta shem kecha nedava. Why would you nadarta shem kecha nedava? So elo im kamashen nadarta sisa yei neder. Look, if you offered the korban properly, if you made a pledge, a neder, to bring a korban shlamim, and you offered it as a korban shlamim, so great, then yeah, you fulfilled your neder. But if you said that you're going to bring if you pledged to bring a korban shlamim, but then you offered it as an ola, for example, well then, v'imlav yehi nedava. It'll be a nedava, it'll be kosher, sure, you could bring it as a separate a separate nedava, a separate korban that you're bringing, sure, but it's not going to fulfill your obligation of the neder that you made, that you will still have to offer. V'tztich motzes vasech v'tztich zos ha-Torah. Now, we also had the pasuk just a few minutes ago of zos ha-Torah, right? We compared all of the korbanos to the shlamim to say that there's a chiyuv of lishma by Shinui Baylim as well as by Shinui Kodesh by all of the korbanos. So we need the pasuk of motzes vasech tishma vasisa as well as zos ha-Torah. Why? Because the ikas of achmana motza, if we only have the pasuk of motza svasecha tishma vasisa, so where's that goes a bach? So hava amina lo yadaina b'mai, because Rachmana zos atar, right? If we would only have motzas fasecha, that there's the neder and then there's nedava. If you have lishma, then great. If not, then it's a nedava, etc. Well, what does that apply to? So that's why I need zos haTorah to say, well, it applies to all of the korbanos because of Rachmana zos haTorah. And if we would only have this application to all of the korbanos, have a minute lifsilu, I might think, okay, and if you don't have lishma by Shinui Baylim, by Shinui Kodesh, maybe the whole korban should be possible. So because of Achman and Motzos Vasecha, that's why we have the pasuk of Motzes Fasecha with the kind of two-tiered approach with the neder and the nedava. If you do it properly, it's a neder. Otherwise, it's a nedava. Anyways, Chaver, now we have completed Daf Daled of Masechta Zevachim. Wow, that was an intense daf, but also an intensely awesome daf. Okay, Chaver, Gevalig. So just to review what we've accomplished on daf. Is somebody at the door? Who cares? Just to review what we've accomplished on Daf Daled of Masechta Zevachim, and I feel like the word accomplish is appropriate here. I feel like we really did accomplish it. We worked hard in order to learn out what we learned on Daf Daled. So the requirement of Lishmah, of Lishmah by Shinui Kodesh for a korban shelamim, we learned that out. And then we worked hard to learn out the requirement of Lishmah by Shinui Baylim, also by a shelamim. And then once we figured out, and this of course was by the Shechita, the Kabbalah, the Olacha, the Zrika, once we learned out all of these things, all of these requirements by shelamim, we then learned out Lishmah and lishem Baylim for all korbonis. We then managed to extend that to all of the korbonis. We worked hard, but we accomplished here on Daf Daled of Masechta Zevachim. Hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoy your day or night and your lives. Cheers.